What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for We Happy Few. An odd game that is a sort of mix of survival elements and action-adventure with a heavy focus on its narrative. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link in the description below that covers everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of We Happy Few, it's a slightly older title, originally releasing back in, I believe it was 2018, but the reason I'm taking a look at it these days is A, just kind of general curiosity, but also because this game was developed by Compulsion Games, which is currently working on another title called South of Midnight that looks really interesting to me, and I wanted to familiarize myself with a bit of their prior work. So let's talk about what this game is, because it's trying to do a lot of things, some of them successfully, others not so much, and in the broadest possible sense, I would mostly say that We Happy Few is a solid, short experience stretched out over way too much game. Simply put, it goes on way too long, which overshadows a lot of its better moments, such as its overall story, and even how some of its gameplay mechanics play into that exact narrative, which can lead to a lot of moments that have the feeling of you being boxed in or the world closing in around you, which can be reflected in subtle things such as the town areas of the game having buildings that somewhat curve towards the road, making it feel like they're always kind of leaning in on you. And that's to say nothing of the more obvious stuff, like the incredibly creepy masks and whatnot that all serve a purpose to the narrative and the atmosphere of the title. But before we dive into all that, let's first talk about the technical state of this game. It's not particularly old, but how is it running these days? Well, other than some minor hiccups, it was mostly pretty good for me, at least. The game crashed on me twice over the course of about 50 hours, and everything else was pretty much just minor bugs, such as NPCs sitting not actually on a bench, but rather in the air next to the bench when you would go to mantle, that is to say climb up something. The animation for this can be really weird, and sometimes you'd be like to the left or right of where you thought you were, which isn't usually a big deal, but sometimes it would cause you to just fall right back down. But nothing really game-breaking by any stretch of the imagination, which might be more or less what you'd expect from a title that is only about 6 years old. Next up, let's talk about difficulty. Now, this game does boast a variety of different game modes, and pretty much all of them have an adjustable difficulty when you start. Now, you can, at a base, pick just easy, normal, hard, and this effectively decides how often you're going to be in combat, because what it determines is how irritable, let's say, that NPCs can be, because depending on your player actions, that is to say the things you do in the world, as well as how your character is dressed in a given area, etc., can set NPCs off, and the difficulty of the game adjusts how quickly they will do that. However, there is a customizable option here that allows you to get a little more granular with the difficulty, adjusting specific elements of it, such as how impactful the survival elements are, or if they even matter at all, and things of that nature. So there is a fair bit of customizable difficulty here, but at the same time, nothing truly crazy. From there, though, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, this, of course, is for the main game, as opposed to the other game modes you can fire up. And to that end, while I'm not going to spoil everything by any means, there are a couple of things I want to talk about here that I think could be considered spoilers, and if you ever want to play this game for yourself, or if that's something you care about, maybe you want to skip ahead past this part a little bit. Otherwise, though, We Happy Few takes place in a fictional place known as Wellington Wells, a series of islands that are actually procedurally generated every time you fire up a game, so the map is never quite the same, which in a weird way I think feeds into the drug-fueled dystopia that makes up the rest of it. However, Wellington Wells is set during an alternative version of World War II. Basically, a few different things happened that caused the USA to never actually join in on the war, and thus things took a very different turn. It's never explicitly stated how these things actually panned out, but then we have Wellington Wells. This place was effectively captured, but in order to maintain their control over the area, everyone in the town agreed to demands to give up their children and put put them all on trains. They were supposed to get them back. It clearly didn't quite go down that way, and that's where things got a little out of hand. Now, in exchange for this as well, the islands here were essentially locked off from contact basically anywhere else, which led to the current forming of what's going on here. Basically, in order for all of the adults left in the area to forget the horrible thing they did to maintain their freedom, they start taking a drug called joy. This drug shatters your short-term memory while also making you very happy and euphoric, thus allowing them to forget the terrible things they did 15 years ago from the start of the game. And what's more, that short-term memory loss bleeds into a lot of all of the other elements of the game and the narrative itself, as things might not necessarily be what you think they are simply because of the effect joy has on one's perception, but also what it does to their memory, which adds a certain unreliable narrator effect to the story that I really appreciated. But that's sort of the general setup of the world, but what about the actual story? Well, structurally, the story takes place over 3 different acts where you play as one of 3 different characters. The first act is by far the most fleshed out, and this is where we play as Arthur. You start as a editor redacting information from a paper, only to be suddenly reminded of someone from your past named Percy that convinces you to stop taking your joy, thus allowing you to see things as they are, which gets you labeled as a downer, basically someone that is making everybody else sad. And what they do with these people is that they simply throw them out of town into what is called the Garden District, where everyone is essentially dressed in rags and barely holding on, which is where some of the game's main mechanics surrounding blending in as much as you can in order to bypass as many people as possible to get to your objective, while at the same time trying to cater to your own survival needs. But Arthur's main goal throughout all of this is simply to escape Wellington Wells so he can track down his brother Percy, who was separated from him when they shipped all the kids off 15 years ago, as Arthur was just slightly too old to be sent off, but Percy was. And this is the longest of the game's stories, mostly because it's doing all of the heavy work in terms of introducing you to all these different mechanics. But then once Arthur escapes, it switches over to a new character, Sally Boyle. Sally is Arthur's prior love interest, but also somebody who just kind of gets around town. And she plays very differently from Arthur. Arthur is your good all-around character, whereas Sally here is physically frail but very smart and good at a chemistry table but can't craft any mechanical things. But you can use her ability to craft all this chemistry stuff to then sell it, make a bunch of money, buy what you need, and simply avoid combat as much as possible, even in indirect ways using her chemicals. But the real catch about Sally is that this chapter introduces a new mechanic you have to deal with, which is caring for her baby, the first child born in Wellington Wells in 15 years, though one random mention says it's 17 years, but the game itself seems odd about how this actually works. And her goal, after running into Arthur, is to escape this place and also take care of her baby, because one side effect of all these people, if you haven't seen it on screen yet, being on their joy is that anybody deemed as different or simply making everybody else sad is dealt with very violently, which is obviously a no-go for a baby. So with Sally, you have to manage the needs of your baby, like getting back home to change and feed her while also trying to complete your story objectives, so this one becomes a little more stressful as a result, but does get easier over the course of that chapter. But the real kicker here is that Act 2 and Act 3 actually reset the map that you're in. That is to say, it rolls a brand new world, meaning that everything you just learned as Arthur, in terms of how things were laid out, is completely wiped away, and you have to find new pathways to get basically everywhere, which in a game where most of what you're doing is blending in, running around, and trying to find the correct route to a place that's going to get you the least amount of problems, gets to be a bit of a headache. I was not fond of that surprise, even if I do think Sally's chapter was probably the best overall. But then for chapter 3, we play as Ollie Starkey, a war veteran, a group of people still on the islands here, were the area's standing army. Ollie makes a very shocking discovery that I don't want to ruin here, that then leads to another even greater discovery that puts the entire island at risk, and he has to get answers. Now Ollie, unlike the other two, Few is a much more combat-oriented character. You're going to get up close and melee pretty regularly if you want, and sneaking around as him is basically impossible. Where the other two characters do their best to blend in, Ollie actually has a lot of trouble with that, meaning that no matter what difficulty you have the game on, NPCs tend to react very violently to Ollie's presence. And he doesn't have a lot of capability for stealth either, so you kind of have to navigate your way around that, and you're going to find yourself in combat a lot. Now, each of these individual characters is going to affect Wellington Wells through the course of their journey by learning and exposing certain secrets. Because as you might have gathered from it being 15 years since all of the children were shipped off, things have progressed in the outside world, and the technology and everything that is developed here in isolation isn't quite cutting it anymore because there aren't any children, nothing's being maintained, and it's a dystopia on the verge of collapse. And seeing the game through these different perspectives and how each of them views the world and the things they themselves have to come to terms with as they come off of joy and regain memories that were very painful to relearn makes for a really, really compelling story that did a lot of great things, but it's interspersed with having to constantly run around town or across the map suddenly, which gets annoying because they're interrupting a really great story. But broadly speaking about the story, I thought the general premise of it was great. Really good writing, a lot of the revelations made a lot of sense. I love how some of the game mechanics informed the story itself, as for instance, you can actually take joy and it might be advantageous to do so in certain situations, but this can lead to withdrawals and memory loss that you then have to deal with, which can be circumvented entirely by a secondary drug called Sunshine, which doesn't actually do anything to you except mimic the effects of joy without any of the downsides. And there's all sorts of little stuff like that throughout this game. But that brings us to our progression systems. Now, progression in We Happy Few is actually really simple stuff. It basically comes down to crafting and your skills. Now, as you complete quests across the game, you'll earn skill points. The amount is going to vary for each character, as Arthur has the most in terms of like side quests and general activities you can get up to, whereas Sally and Ollie actually both have a sort of timer mechanic. The baby in terms of Sally, and then Ollie has to watch his blood sugar level, and thus both of their stories are much, much shorter than Arthur's, so they get more skills per quest, basically. That said, you can spend those skill points on individual perks and upgrades, which will increase your ability at a specific type of activity, such as survival, stealth, combat, or a few things specific to your character. Now, some of the best upgrades in this regard are the ones that simply make it easier to blend in. For instance, in the town areas, initially when you get there, you really shouldn't be running because running draws attention and you'll get attacked. However, there are skills you can pick up for Sally and Arthur that remove that penalty, allowing you to do things like run and thus get around faster in town without drawing attention and getting into fights constantly. And stuff like that tends to be really high value as far as skills go. But another portion of skills is that each of our three characters has a different skill set. Ollie can't do chemistry but can work on a regular mechanical workbench, whereas Sally cannot but is great at chemistry. Ollie can't do stealth, but he can excel in combat. And just little trade-offs like that built into the skill system make each character feel unique, even if they don't all get the same amount of screen time. But in talking about that, I mentioned some crafting. Basically, as each character moves through the game, they can find a bunch of recipes that will help them craft things. Most importantly, probably your healing items, frankly, because it's easy to lose health in this game. And when you die, you'll usually just get kind of thrown into an area nearby, having lost a bit of progress, and also a bit of health in terms of your currently available health, which means you can back yourself into a situation where you don't have a lot of healing items, and you're stuck where they are not readily available to craft, which can lead to a slight problem. But otherwise, the crafting system is generally as easy as opening up the crafting menu and crafting certain things, though sometimes you need to go to a proper workbench to make this happen, and it's pretty much your usual stuff in terms of equipment or clothes that are going to allow you to blend in here. So crafting is important, keep your eye out for recipes. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section. Now, as I've already mentioned up to this point, the game does feature a handful of procedural elements. Now, this is essentially just the map of the world you are in. Each chapter seemed to have specific quests that would spawn in somewhere, but where they are and thus the layout of the map and how to get any individual direction could change quite a bit playthrough to playthrough, which can complicate even basic things like the fact that you need to sleep, eat, or drink. Now, while these things getting low won't generally kill you or anything, they will give you debuffs if you let them go too far, or buffs if you take care of them, such as sprinting, costing less stamina, that kind of thing. Now, otherwise, the game world can be effectively divided into two different types of island. The Garden District islands, which are basically the wilds, where you're going to find people down on their luck or out of their minds with plague, trying to kill you and attack you for looking too fancy. Around these people, you need to wear ragged, torn up clothes to not be noticed. And then there's the villages, as they're called, or basically anywhere in town, and these people want you to be on joy and not causing a ruckus, essentially, meaning that you need to be very careful, wear properly tailored clothing, and the usual stuff. Now, in both cases, though, attacking anyone or stealing from anyone, trespassing, etc. is also a pretty good way to set them off, regardless of how you look and how well you're blending in. Now, you're going to be doing a lot of running around in this game, a lot of back and forth, and the good news there is a little bit of fast travel, but it's not a lot. So there are what they call track access points, where effectively you can find a little bunker hidden around a map, usually one per island, where you'll be able to set up shop and flip a switch that allows you to fast travel to that area from basically anywhere. But because there's only one per island, and some of these islands can be quite big, you can only get so close to an objective, and you have to unlock these to begin with. So it doesn't necessarily do a whole bunch to alleviate the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of running around. But one of my favorite things about this game was simply how the world and its ideals influence the gameplay and mechanics. So for instance, we have joy, the drug everybody's on. You can actually take this joy, and in some cases you might need to get past certain checkpoints that are designed to see if someone is on joy or not. However, taking joy can affect your memory, and after the effect wears off, you go into withdrawals, at which point it makes it easier for NPCs to see that you are not on your joy unless you get attacked. And there's a lot of moments like that where the story and what is going on narratively is backed up by the actual actions you're taking within the game, which is always a nice touch. But that's to say nothing of the game's incredible atmosphere. This game does such a great job, even with its rather clumsy looking graphics, at conveying the idea that you are not safe, that something is wrong. And it's easy to point to the obvious stuff, like the fact that everybody's wearing these white masks that are designed to force them to smile, by the way, in case you were wondering. And then there's how things are presented, how people talk, the fact that there are TVs acting as cameras basically everywhere, that makes you feel like you're living in a bit of a police state, because that's effectively what it is, and they're trying to keep everyone drugged and happy. But what I really liked here was all the subtle ways that they did this at the same time, such as I mentioned earlier, the fact that all of the buildings are kind of curved in towards the road to make it feel like they're looming over you. And the game does so many wonderful little things that are designed, I imagine, to make you feel uneasy and like someone's always out to get you, because they're always watching you and waiting for you to slip up, which is effectively what's happening gameplay-wise. And that back and forth is something I really loved. But unfortunately, the downside to that is that a lot of the gameplay simply comes down to trying to maintain your basic needs while also finding a way to get to the next quest objective, because otherwise, thanks to the procedural generation, etc., once you've been to all the islands, there's really just not much to see or do or find in terms of exploration, which means there's not much variety to the gameplay. And after, I would say, about 20 or so hours for myself, is where that basic gameplay loop kind of starts to fall apart a little bit, and you're basically just doing the same thing over and over again. At which point I was ready for the game to end, but that's usually the point at which you're not even all the way through Arthur's playthrough and you've got a lot more to go, which is why I say this game was simply stretched out over way too much time. However, before we move on from this section, you do not technically need to simply hang around the main story if you prefer, because there are actually other modes of the game you can play, such as survival or night watch or a sandbox mode. So there are other ways to play this game besides just just the story, but to be honest with you, I don't think the gameplay loop is strong enough for long enough to really bother with those things. And that's before we've even started talking about combat. Now, combat in this title comes down to melee, stealth, and throwables effectively. You don't get much in the way of ranged weaponry outside of throwables initially, and then one or two of the DLCs gives you some options there as well. But there's not like a gun or a projectile thing you can do here. It's all pretty much melee weaponry, which brings us to stealth or open combat. Now, stealth is pretty straightforward. There's a whole bunch of perks that will assist you with this, making you harder to detect or deal more damage from stealth, that kind of thing. Or even one that allows you the basic upgrade of taking out the cop NPCs, which are much bigger and will normally break free if you don't have that perk, allowing you to take them out completely. You can also conceal yourself in the tall yellow flowers around, so stealth is a viable and often easiest way to play. But then there's open combat. So first of all, you have to divide this into lethal and non-lethal attacks. Killing anyone in this game is a choice you're making because there are things like padded weaponry that allow you to attack without dealing lethal damage, which is also true for the occasional throwable. Now otherwise though, combat's kind of boring. It's basically a melee swing system, and you can occasionally shove enemies if they're right in front of you, and you can block and parry and whatnot, but it's basically just attack enemies or wait for them to attack and then block or parry and then attack them, which is pretty boring. And the perks for this basically just allow you to do things like charge up your melee attacks or give you passives, so they're not exactly a huge help here. Now you can avoid most combat in this game, thankfully. There's not a whole lot of need to directly assault much of anything, though it is technically possible. But because the combat system is so bare bones, my main takeaway is that while it did occasionally have its moments where a lot of these white mask individuals running up on you was just incredibly creepy, for the most part the combat system of this game is pretty forgettable because there's just practically nothing here to engage with beyond what you're going to grasp in like the first 5 minutes of doing it, which is where I think the DLC tried to alleviate some of those problems. So let's move on to talking about the DLC. This game got 3 of them, each of them doing something a little bit different while taking you through a story based on characters you'll have met throughout the actual campaign. Now the first 2 are basically standalone and don't really add much to the game. They're both incredibly short, like a couple hours tops. But then we have the last DLC called We All Fall Down. This is a direct continuation of the story that wraps it up and shows you the future that is in store for Wellington Wells. But let's start at the beginning. The first DLC is called They Came From Below, and it's a sort of War of Worlds type thing, where you're suddenly getting invaded by robots and you have to help Dr. Faraday from the campaign put a stop to them to the best of your abilities. Now the fun part about this is that they give you a ray gun that gets upgraded over the course of the DLC that you can shoot robots and everything with. Combine that with some, I would say, pretty solid level building and a fun boss at the end of it, and this was a decent DLC, if a bit short. Then we have Lightbearer. Lightbearer puts you in the role of one Nick Lightbearer, a famous musician from this world that you'll also have met in the campaign, but this time we're playing as him, which comes with a few unique things, like the fact that he uses a guitar in an attempt to block, parry, and attack enemies, and attacking them is actually blowing their mind with your amazing musical talent until they pass out, which I thought was pretty funny. Otherwise though, this DLC focuses around Nick because he woke up covered in blood from a bender, which leads to a bit of a murder investigation that you've got to get to the bottom of, which was pretty fun. Again, good concept, but a very short DLC overall, this one taking like 2 hours. Then we have We All Fall Down. Now, in Ollie Starkey's chapter of the game, he actually kidnaps a woman in order to get some answers about something. We All Fall Down puts you in the role of that woman, freshly off of her joy, who just so happens to be the daughter of someone important, and thus felt a great desire to actually try to make sure that she could save these people from themselves, if possible, and you set about to doing just that. Now, this is the longer of the 3 DLCs, but also it gives you access to some fun stuff like a whip for traversal and enemy combat. There's actually a combo with the whip in particular that allows you to push back and then knock down enemies, and new ways to interact with the gadgets of the game, such as a little conductor gun that lets you shoot and disable electronics for a little while, just to name a couple. But because the story of the main game was so strong to begin with, this one, giving it a proper ending, makes it easily the best DLC overall, and the playtime for this is probably more like 5 to 10 hours depending on how quick you are. So overall the DLC is mostly decent, with the last one being the best. Which brings us to the Steam Deck section of the game. So in terms of the Steam Deck, We Happy Few is running very, very well. The system requirements for this game are incredibly low, with the recommended graphics card actually being several generations behind what the Steam Deck has. So despite it being a relatively newer title, the Steam Deck easily handles this game and you shouldn't have much issues there. It has things like cloud saves, controller support, etc. So the Steam Deck should be a perfectly good way to play this game if you would like to, seeing as it's verified and whatnot. So from there, let's talk positives and negatives. So the positives of this game for me were, for starters, the story. I loved the concept and how they play around with exactly how the narrative elements they've set up would interact with the world, such as joy affecting people's memory and whatnot. So while I enjoyed the story, I think the real highlight and one of the biggest positives about this game period is the fact that so many of the gameplay elements of things you're actually doing are directly informed by the narrative of how those things work at the same time, on top of just a fantastically creepy atmosphere. In that way, I think the game was very, very fun, and considering they front load that with a very strong opener, I can see why a lot of people enjoy this game and leave it a positive review, even if the game does still get its fair share of criticism. And in terms of negatives, including my own criticisms, I would say that this game feels incredibly padded out. Like there is just so much ground to cover and little annoyances to work your way around that you can't help but feel like this is probably like a 15 to 20 hour experience stretched out over a runtime that is easily double that. Not least of which is constantly having to run from one end of the map to the other, with the fast travel points rarely being of great usefulness there. Now, another thing that makes all that running around so tedious is the fact that combat is not exactly an incredible system. It's very, very basic, and combined with the game's relatively straightforward gameplay loop, it's easy to find yourself getting bored pretty quickly after you've learned those initial things, which can just generally be kind of annoying after a while, which brings me to my conclusion for this title. We Happy Few is an interesting game for a lot of different reasons, and in many ways I could definitely say it is somewhat unique. And when things are working, they are working incredibly well, from the atmosphere, the story, the running around, how any individual action you might take might cause this ripple effect that leads to a bunch of nonsense you have to deal with, is a really cool system at face value, but that's juxtaposed against the fact that you're often going to find yourself in this procedural world that once you've got the things you need out of it initially, you're going to realize that there's just not really much of anything else there. It barely matters what you do to the citizens beyond what it costs you in health. There's a ton of backtracking through those civilians, and then a rougher than average combat system, I would say. So for me at least, I bought this game for myself for about $20 US during a Steam sale last year. And for that price, I honestly do feel like I got my money's worth out of it. I had a bizarrely good time running around a very bizarre universe that, while it ran on a little long, was mostly fun. However, the catch to this is, this game full price on Steam is still like $60, which is frankly asking way too much for what this game is. But the good news there is that this game is on sale all the time these days. It's on sale at the time of this video for like the next week at 75% off, including the DLCs. So it's literally available for like $20, including the DLCs right now. And for that price, I think it's much easier to overlook some of the game's more obvious flaws. Flaws that would prevent me from ever wanting to pay $60 for this, which essentially means, what I'm trying to say here, is that We Happy Few is a ton of fun for $20. It's got a really, really interesting story, and I think it's a real shame that a lot of people are very likely to burn out on the actual gameplay gameplay and mechanics of this game before they reach the ending of that story. But I think that is where we are going to leave it for today. So that has been my review of We Happy Few. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, but either way, let me know what you think about this title down in the comment section below. Though regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.